Okay. So I think we're all set now. And I'm going to minimize the picture. So the exam is in 3 parts. I said that. Final exam study guide. Okay, so we've worked through chapters 1 through 9. And let me make that just a little bit bigger. Chapter 10, do you have any questions about chapter 10, or do you want me to run through those quickly? Okay. Hearing none, I will work through those quickly, but don't hesitate to interrupt me if you need to. Freud thought that one of the main points of psychotherapy was to take things that were not available to you in your conscious being and bring them into consciousness. So that sort of is the whole crux of psychoanalytic or psychodynamic theory, that idea that we're not really consciously aware of why we do the things we do. Why do we like certain people and not other people? You probably have friends of friends who you don't like, right? You like the friend, but you don't necessarily like all of their friends. But you can't necessarily put your finger on it. It's like, I don't know, I just don't like that person, or I don't enjoy being around that person. And sometimes you can give some evidence, but if you think about the evidence that you give, other people could have done those very same things, and you would say, oh, I don't mind them so much. There are other things that are about them that I like. So what Freud said was, there's something buried, there's something underneath that's causing our behavior that we're not consciously aware of. And that's the sole reason really for psychotherapy, is to bring that from the subconscious level up into conscious awareness so that you can do something about it. You can't fix a problem that you don't know the cause of in that view. The psychoanalytic explanations for behavior is that these unconscious motivations drive our behavior. They don't determine it, completely. We are able to make our own decisions and to be self-deterministic in some ways. But a large part of why we do the things we do, and how much of them we do and when we do them, has things that are not available to us. So the psychoanalytic explanation is that, and also that nothing happens by accident. So if you have a slip of the tongue, what has happened is something in your unconscious wants it to be this other way. And so when you said it the wrong way, that's because you wanted it to be that way, but it's not really that way. If you're late to a dentist appointment, it's because you didn't really want to go. And you can blame it on traffic, and you can blame it all kinds of things, but or perhaps you weren't confident about how that thing was going to go. You were late to meeting somebody. And Freud would say, well, it must be that you just don't care about that person, or you're afraid of that person, or something else. And you would say, no, I was just late. Like, sometimes I'm just late. For Freud, nothing happened accidentally. So keep that in mind. The difference between the mind and the brain from a psychodynamic or psychoanalytic perspective, your brain is that physical thing that's in your head, right? Like, we know that there's the biology of the brain. Your mind is what you make of that, what your brain does, and we can't completely explain that even now. I mean, the brain can do amazing things. There's no amount of artificial intelligence and facial recognition and all of those kinds of things that can do as quickly and as accurately what the human brain can do. And so, there's this constant drive to get artificial intelligence to do that. The brain is an amazingly complex and accurate machine in ways that we have not been able to duplicate synthetically. The role and processes of the id, ego, and superego, these are, they're basic definitions. So I would, if it doesn't roll off your tongue yet, I would go back and reread those and try and make some examples. But your ego is your reality. It's what you're actually doing. I'm talking to your ego now. I'm seeing the result of your ego now. What I can't tell is what your underlying desires are, and then what your moral feelings are. And so your pleasure principle, what you would really like to be doing right now, is probably not this, right? If you could pick anything in the world to do, you wouldn't be sitting here at 6:11 p.m. on a Wednesday night.
On the contrary, I want to pass this class with a good grade. So yes, I want to be here more than anything.
All right, well, there you go. Okay, so good point, because you have a reason for it. But that is your superego talking, right? So your id is still telling you, go do something else. It'll be way more fun, right? Just blow it off. You don't need this. Your superego is saying, hey, you've put a lot of work into this semester, Colin, you need for this to pay off. You have long-term goals. This will fulfill one of your goals or partially fulfill one of your goals. So that's your super ego, having more influence than your id and moving you toward this thing. Now, if you can tell me that your id, your pleasure principle, is that this is absolutely the most fun thing you can possibly think of, then I'm going to refer you to therapy. No, you know what I mean. So there you go. So, but good example. It got me to laugh. Conscious and pre-conscious processes. Conscious awareness is what you're aware of right now. Your pre-conscious processes can be brought to your attention. So they're just below the surface. And if somebody mentions it, it's like, oh yeah, I do kind of do that, don't I? And so that difference between what's conscious and what's pre-conscious, subconscious is really varied. Psychic energy, the idea that everything that we do has a reason, right? And this goes to psychic determinism, that we really want to, the world to be in a particular way. And we spend a lot of energy trying to think about things and resolve things and do those kinds of things. Primary and secondary process thinking, I talked about this a little bit in the last review session. System 1 and System 2 thinking, the research of Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky on what they would say is System 1 or primary thinking that's relatively automatic. It tends to be emotional and somewhat impulsive, but it's not based on nothing, right? It isn't, first impressions are sometimes right, and they're right for reasons that you can't necessarily put your finger on, but somewhere deep in the recesses of your mind, according to psychoanalytic theory, you've had all of these experiences, right? You have a lifetime of experience with how things go, and so based on the what's just happened, here's how I think this thing's going to go, or this friendship's going to go, or whatever. So it doesn't come from nowhere. The secondary process thinking, or what Kahneman and Tversky call System 2 thinking, is the more deliberative, logical, and rational thinking that you are consciously aware of, and that you do purposefully. The role of defense mechanisms. Your book, in the intro to the section on psychodynamic theory, I think the intro to chapter, it's the pages that are just prior to chapter 10. It talks about the example of Eliot Spitzer, and Eliot Spitzer was a governor of New York, and he was the attorney general of New York, or governor of New York, whatever. He had, as attorney general, had tried to get enacted laws that were against prostitution, and yet he was caught with a prostitute. And so, how is it that he explains his behavior? Defense mechanisms would say that he would excuse it in some way, that we would find some other reason to do those kinds of things. So defense mechanisms help us to not walk around crying all the time, because if we remembered every mistake we'd ever made, every time we'd hurt somebody's feelings, or we'd been late, or just everything that we'd done, if we allow all of that to accumulate, that's a heavy load. And so defense mechanisms help us to defend our ego, defend our reality against those things by explaining our behavior and excusing our behavior and doing those kinds of things. And we talked about a number of the different defense mechanisms, some of the more common ones: repression, denial, regression, and then some that are less common and a little bit more esoteric. But, there's a long list of defense mechanisms, and if you're interested in that, you can review that section of the book. And then the goal of psychoanalytic therapy, is to bring all of this into conscious awareness so that you can work on it, right? People don't go to therapy generally when everything is going swimmingly. They tend to go to therapy when there's something that they would like to work on. It doesn't mean that it's something bad, but it's just, they feel like there's something that they could be better at. And the goal of psychoanalytic therapy, that form of therapy, is to identify and delve into what some of those unconscious processes might be. Okay, sorry, that was a little bit long. Chapter 11, questions or comments about that one before? Jung was a colleague of and built on the theory of Freud, as Erikson did as well. Jung's theory was the idea that we have this collective unconscious, that there's something shared, culturally among all of us, and that's sort of driving human behavior. Why do people in different cultures or different parts of the world do some of the same things and have some of the same goals and thoughts? It's because of this collective unconscious that he thought of as being present in the mind when you were born, that it was something that was that pervaded everybody. He also talked about the archetypes. What are these major kinds of things that we see, these symbols that we see? And then the idea of anima and animus. The anima, a man's or the male view, and this is a very dichotomous view. So think about when they were developing these theories. Today's theories will have to adapt to other ways of thinking about gender roles and those kinds of things. But for now, the anima is the stereotypically male person's idealized view of a stereotypically idealized woman. And the animus is the woman's view of the idealized man. So those are largely definitions. They may work their way into your own philosophy, your own examples as you move forward in your career. Erikson, another of the proteges of Freud, a neo-Freudian or post-Freudian, psychosocial stages. And if you take a developmental psychology course, you'll talk about that he had a lifespan view, and he said at each stage of the lifespan, usually based on age, especially in the first half of life, that there was a crisis that you needed to resolve in some way. And in psychology, a crisis is a period of active exploration. It's not a bad thing. It's just something that you need to work on. And if you work on it and resolve it, you move forward and you become a better and more complete human. And so Erikson developed these stages all throughout the lifespan. He didn't think that you would get fixated or stuck at one stage. What he said was, if you didn't successfully resolve that, or if it wasn't a pleasant experience for you, that might be something that later in life might still affect you. So if you think about somebody who has a difficult time forming a romantic commitment, right? They date people, but then when it comes to being in a committed relationship, they get cold feet and move on. What Erikson would say about that was somewhere in their distant past, probably in their early childhood, they didn't develop a sense of trust with the people around them. Perhaps they had a chaotic home life, perhaps there were other kinds of things going on, but somehow they didn't form those close early relationships, and that's affecting them as an adult. He did not think that would hold you back forever, just that if you had trouble with a commitment, that you ought to think about where the roots of that came from. When did that start to arise and why? And being able to work through that enables you to work through the crisis and resolve it and develop a sense of trust, and then be more trusting of the people around you and default to, I trust them, and wait for them to do something that makes that not true or not appropriate, rather than not trusting people and then never knowing whether it might have had a good outcome. Object relations theory is the idea, or the sort of the way of thinking about personality and personality psychology, that other people exist in our minds, right? So when I think about any of you, or you think about your friends, my reality of you, you're an object in my mind, and I have a view of you. And it doesn't necessarily matter whether I'm right or not. I mean, I probably don't have one of you because I don't know you that well, but if it's somebody that you have your view of them and why they are the way they are and who they are, and that's your reality. Somebody else could have a different view of them. They could have a different view of themselves, but that object is your object, and that's how you think of them. That's how you experience them. And those construals you have, those ways of interpreting the world that you have, with respect to that person, are your reality. The lasting impact of Freudian ideas based on research is that we're not always aware of what we do. We're not always correct about what the sources of our feelings and behaviors are, and that we do engage in a number of defense mechanisms or ways of interpreting the world. So it's been a really good theory for that. The psychosexual stages, not at all. But some of his other ideas about thinking about the fact that the mind is doing things that we're not necessarily aware of, and they are influencing our daily life. There is something to that, and it's been an active area theorizing. It's not great for scientific research because you can't put your finger on it, but it's been an interesting ride. And then finally, in chapter 11, attachment types. When you think about adult attachment, and when we think about adult attachment, we're talking about the ability to form a secure relationship with somebody else and to trust them, or to have an insecure relationship where you either are sort of clingy and, you know, sort of pushing them away and pulling them back at the same time, or just avoiding things altogether. Those would be what we would consider insecure relationships. Attachment types, when you think about that, form early in life, you know, so this is not unrelated to Erikson's views. You know, are you able to use the people around you as a secure base? If you go to a party with a group of friends, do you feel like because you're there with a group of friends, you can now explore the rest of the party? Because at any point, if things get awkward or if you start to feel you know, alone or conspicuous or whatever it is, and aren't having a good time, you can retreat back to your people. And so that enables you to go out and talk to other people. Sometimes it's easier to meet new people and make friends when you have somebody with you rather than being alone. And so those attachment types play into that. So if you haven't internalized those, I would advise you to sort of look at, you know, secure and insecure attachment types, and also the definition of the strange situation, which is how, or it's a research paradigm that's used to assess attachment styles in young children. Chapter 12. You know, now we get into the existentialists, and I think it's really interesting. You know, a lot of it is beyond the scope of this course. And so you can get into an ethics class or a philosophy class and do more work in that area. The introspectionists thought that one of the ways that we could determine the differences between you all and your friends and other people around you that make you unique is to ask you to introspect and to ask you to sort of think very deeply about something, and then keep dividing it into its subparts. You know, so you could say, you know, I have this glasses case, you know, and what's my experience of it? It has a feel, it has a function, it has a color, it has texture, it has size, it has all of those things. So I can describe how I experience it. And then as an introspectionist or an introspector, I can try and subdivide everything that I've said into something that's more granular and just keep going down the rabbit hole to get more into my knowledge and my experience of something. So introspection it's an interesting technique, and it can be an interesting way to try to understand the human existence on a personal level. Thrownness. You had an assignment about thrownness and angst, and that it'll definitely come up on the test. Thrownness is I love that word, you know, because it's not at all like a fancy word, right? It's like they took the word thrown and then just added something to it. And so you know exactly what it means, but it's the idea that you can be just thrown into a particular culture, a particular situation, and then your personality is going to develop in a different way because of that, right? You didn't choose that situation, but you found yourself there. And the biological theorists would say, well, part of it is your biology, and they're right. And the trait theorists would say, well, part of it is the traits that you bring or that you develop, and they're right as well. But that thrownness is talking about how you didn't get to pick that, you didn't get to choose, and then here's what came up out of where you were. Existentialism and the existential challenge. You know, just that idea that we really, like, if you're super happy all the time, you're probably not doing things right, according to them. You're probably living in what Sartre would call bad faith. That life should be just a little bit harder. And if you're just that happy-go-lucky person all the time, maybe it just looks that way on the outside, and on the inside you really are having deep thoughts. But if you really are just happy-go-lucky all the time, or somebody is, and they're never having any deep thoughts, and they're never worried about anything else, then perhaps they're missing something, right? Because there are some things about life that are complicated, and so you're missing out if you don't think about them in a complicated way. So, you know, that's the 10,000 foot version of existentialism that you can get in just a couple of pages within one chapter of one book on a different topic. But it is, I think, a really interesting concept. Rogers and Maslow, we've talked about before. I don't feel the need to go over those again. Rogers, the idea of congruence, the ideal and real self, and trying to bring those together, and then Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You're probably already tired in your academic career of hearing about that. And if you are, buckle up, because you're going to keep on hearing about it probably in a number of other courses and outside as well in real life. The concept of flow, flow is losing yourself. And so I can be working, you can be working on something at your computer, and then you look up and it's like, how can it already be 6 o'clock? I still have other stuff to do and I've lost track of time, but I've enjoyed what I'm doing. It doesn't necessarily mean I was smiling all the time though. So you can be in flow and not be laughing and joking and all of those kinds of things. But what flow does for you is get you really engaged. Your skill level matches the task. You're a little bit challenged by it, but you're not overwhelmed and you're not bored, and you're able to move forward. And that's where you're most likely to lose track of time and think in that way. Kelly's personal construct theory. I really like that, and also the role construct rep test. Thinking about the constructs that you have, how do you evaluate other people? What are the things that are important to you? And if you're describing your mother, what are some qualities that your mother has? And then you're describing somebody that you work with, and what are the qualities that they have? And then you're describing somebody who's in one of your classes, and what are the qualities that they have? And when you start to see common themes of the qualities that these people have, it turns out that that's probably a construct that has meaning to you, that's important to you. One of the examples that I use is if you have complicated friends, and a lot of people do, it's like, oh, of course there was drama, because of this person, there's always drama for this person. If you have complicated friends, and you find that this person is complicated in this way, and this person is complicated in this way, but other people are always saying, it's like, oh, are you going to invite that person because there's always drama? There's something about those people that you like. There's something about people with drama that you like. And so the role construct rep test helps you to understand what those common themes are. And then Rogers, the role of unconditional positive regard, that flows back into number 4. Rogers is a humanist. And so the humanists are really looking at, what is the human condition and how can we make it better, right? What are the things that we can do that will maximize or enhance or make it so that people are in flow and are more fulfilled and those kinds of things. Chapter 13, the cultural chapter, we didn't spend a lot of time on it in class, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it on the test. Knowing the definitions for ethnocentrism and cultural relativism will help you. Knowing the difference between an individualistic society and a collectivist society. As you start to analyze people, as you go forward from this class, and you meet people who are from, or whose families are from, a collectivist society, perhaps an Eastern society, you may start to see differences in the way they interpret other people's actions, the way they interpret their own actions, what it is that they're looking for in life. And so, that's where the culture can influence the people. And if you go back to the concept of thrownness, if you were thrown into that culture as an infant, you would also have adopted those things. In-group and out-group biases, it's much easier for you to distinguish people within your in-group, right? Within your in-group, you notice all of the differences that people have. But when you think about an out-group, they kind of all look the same to you. You don't know a lot about them, and they have some common feature in personality or drive or lineup it is. And so you tend to notice your in-group differences, but for the out-group, you tend not to. That's why in a lineup, or if you're asked to testify about somebody that you've seen commit a crime, if it's somebody who shares characteristics that are similar to you, you'll be better at describing some of the nuances of how that person looked, compared to if it's a group that you don't have things in common with, because you're not practiced at seeing those distinctions in the same way. Chapter 14, those are largely definitions. I don't think we need to go into them in any great detail. Utilitarianism, the greatest good for the greatest number of people. Hedonism, sort of the pursuit of the most pleasure that anybody can have. Empiricism, that sort of idea that things happen for a reason and things can be a little bit more concrete. Behaviorism, rewards, punishments. So I would go through those definitions and just jot them down or internalize them if, the ones that you're not as familiar with. Reciprocal determinism is that one thing determines something and then it also sort of goes in both directions, right? My behavior causes this thing to happen. This thing happening causes my behavior to be different in some way. And so there's that two-way street, that bidirectionality. Chapter 15, let me make that just a little bit smaller so I can see the rest of it. Chapter 15, talks about different, and so, chapter 15 is a tough one because it's different in the two different books, depending on whether you have whether you have the 7th edition or the 8th edition. So I think what you'll find is if you have the 8th edition, the material in chapter 15 or these concepts in chapter 15 are in chapters 13 and 14, and something else is in chapter 15. And things that are in chapter 15 now, it's kind of a mess. So there's not a lot from chapter 15 that it's going to work its way onto the test for that reason. So I'm just looking at this. So I think you can largely ignore chapter 15 for that reason. I don't think, I think looking at those things and knowing what they are is always going to help you because I'm actually more interested in what you know going forward from this course than how you do on the test, but I think they're both important, and I know they're both important to you. Chapter 16 starts to talk about the self in more detail, that distinction between the I and the me, the person that experiences things, and then the observer who is making judgments about that. Procedural and declarative self. Your declarative self is your narrative story, what you can tell about yourself. Your procedural self is actually what you're doing. The declarative and procedural selves, there are a number of definitions in the text on that, so I'll leave that to you all. And then chapter 17, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for psychological disorders. The main purposes for that are so we can diagnose things, right? So that we can have a common agreement that when there's this cluster of symptoms in a person at this severity, that this is the disorder, this is what we're going to call that disorder. So we're not all trying to explain different parts of the same thing using different terminology and not understanding where the commonalities are. So the DSM is very helpful for agreeing on the diagnostic criteria. It's also very helpful for health insurance. We need those codes in order to qualify for reimbursement, to be able to get health insurance to pay for certain things. So the DSM serves both an interesting and intellectual function, but also a practical function. So I think it's important to know that it's used for both of those things. The criteria for something to be a disorder, it needs to be distressful and dysfunctional. So it needs to deviate from the norm, so it's not normal behavior. It causes distress to the person who has it, or it would if they were self-aware, if they knew, if they knew what reality was and the difference between what they're doing and reality or what would be the norm. And also dysfunctional. It needs to prevent them from carrying on the activities of their normal life in the way that you would expect. And so that's what makes something a disorder. And that's why when you start to look at different behaviors and it's like, well, I often, when I'm leaving the house, come back in and check all the doors to make sure that they're locked. Do I have obsessive compulsive disorder? Probably not. So it's not way out of the norm to do that. It's not dysfunctional. It's not interrupting my life. It takes me a little bit of it might take somebody a couple more seconds, or they might get out of the car and run in and check just one more time because they probably have left things unlocked before. And, it's been their experience that it's worth checking. And, so that doesn't deviate from the norm, and it's not dysfunctional, and it doesn't cause them distress. So there you go with that. Ego-syntonic and ego-dystonic definitions. There are things that make us feel better and there are things that make us not feel so good. So when you think about those, I don't, just definitions. If you want to use some fancy words coming out of this course, then go back and pick up the existential arguments and then start to apply it to some of these different areas and you'll be in good shape. Matching behavioral patterns with personality disorders, that's not going to be on the final exam. It was something that I was thinking about, but there's just way too many of them. And so I don't think that you'll find, if you find if a question has slipped in that I haven't taken out, it'll be something that's super obvious. So you wouldn't necessarily, you wouldn't have any trouble with that. And then chapter 18 is that wrap up. How do we, what have we learned so far? What are the different approaches to personality? So what's the psychodynamic approach? What's the biological approach? How, what is it that they're good at? And then what are the things that they're not so good at that another theory might be able to help us with that? And that's where those multiple approaches can be helpful. Knowing the unconscious motivations from a psychodynamic view, knowing the biology of the person from the biological view, knowing how that gives rise to certain traits and how that influences their existence. All of those things I think can be really interesting. And so that's sort of the crux of this book is, sure, biological and traits seem to explain a lot, and that's where most of the current research is, but these other theories are also helpful. And then construals, I'll just say one more time, your construal is your experience of how these things are happening. So your construal is what it is. Like if you remember something in a particular way, that's how you experienced it. And so when other people disagree with you, it's fine to disagree, except that it is your experience of it. So if you found that thing upsetting, it was upsetting, right? That was your construal of it. And for somebody else to say, no, it wasn't upsetting, they're not answering the right question, because what you're saying is this was my experience of it, and what they're saying was this is my experience of it, and those two things are different, and we know that. Benefits and costs of labeling. The benefit of labeling is we can understand something better. So if you know that, if you can put a label on something and say, that person has obsessive compulsive disorder, and here's why. It's helpful, right? Because you put a label on it. Nobody likes to go to the doctor and then come home and they say, well, they didn't find anything, right? I feel terrible and I've had all these symptoms and they don't know what it is. We're not satisfied with that. We would like a label. Now, if they say you have, ego dystonia, and you're like, okay, I don't know what that is, but I'm going to go look it up. At least now I know what it is and I can work on it. So that's the benefit of labeling. The disadvantage of labeling is if I say I'm an ego dystonic person or I'm an obsessive compulsive person, then I feel like it's not something that I can control or do anything about. And so, labels can be self-fulfilling as well, right? So if I think that I have that thing, then perhaps I won't continue working on it as much because it's perhaps something outside of my control. I have it, and then I can work on other things, but I don't do anything about it. So labels can go both ways. They help us to understand something, but they can also be detrimental. One of the things that you'll find when you talk about psychological disorders is that people who work in that field say, don't call somebody a schizophrenic, call them a person with schizophrenia. Don't call somebody, something else. Don't refer to somebody as autistic, refer to them as a person with autism, because they are a person and they have this cluster of things that have been diagnosed. So that's where they go with that. All right. And then the short answer essays, there'll be 2, and you need to answer both of them. I'm looking for a paragraph of about 100 words for each one. You have half an hour, I believe, for that one, either 20 minutes or half an hour. Colin knows. And which is it, Colin? 20 minutes or half an hour?
That would be half an hour.
Half an hour. Okay, there you go. 15 minutes for each one. You'll do them one at a time, and 100 words, right? You don't have to tell me everything, but I do want it to be all in your own words. So don't, it is fine to use other resources. It is an open book test, but when you're actually explaining it, do what I'm doing here, which is explaining it in your own words. Think about how much more interesting that is. Not that it's interesting, but how much more interesting it is than if I was reading from a prepared script to you or reading from slides. Just the act of you using your own voice to describe something makes it more memorable for you, and you've learned more, and you've shown me that you've learned more. So use your own voice, take some chances. You don't have to be correct about everything that you say if the gist of what you say is right. So take some chances, use your own examples. And just write whatever you're thinking. That's what I want to hear. That's my opportunity to hear your voice just one more time. Realistic accuracy model, you're familiar with what that is. The application of trait and biological theories to a particular example. So, how could you explain somebody's personality using the big 5 traits, for example, or using the biology of personality and the biological underpinnings of personality? For number 3, the situationist view. Is it, what is personality? Is it something that we bring to the table? Or is it something that is always dependent on the situation that we find ourselves in? And so that is presented well in the beginning of the book. And so I would just review, what are the sort of main points of the situationist side of the argument? Because I think Funder does a really good job of presenting their side and then tearing it apart somewhat and saying that they're not right. So again, 100 words, right? Just try to explain to somebody who's never taken this course what the situationist view is, use a couple of examples from their argument, and then answer those. And then thrownness and angst, you can go back and review that section of that concept that we already talked about in this session, so I don't need to go over that one again. Okay. So that's it for the test. We're at 45 minutes. That took longer than I thought. Sorry. Do you have questions about any of those things? Do you feel like you're in good shape?
I do have one question. I cut out very briefly, I think all the way back during that chapter 9. And there was one thing think you were about to explain. I think it was secondary thinking or something like that. Yeah, secondary process thinking. Could you just give me what that was?
Sure. Primary process thinking is system 1 thinking. It's automatic, it's emotional, it's just sort of like it's your first impression kind of thinking. And it tends to be relatively automatic. Secondary process thinking is more deliberative, it's more rational, it's more logical. It's you sitting down and thinking about what's your opinion about something. When somebody says, the schools aren't opening, the schools are going all online, what's your immediate gut reaction? That's your system 1 or your primary process thinking. And then when you start to think about what that entails and what the risks are and what the benefits are and how you think, that's your secondary process thinking. That's what you're consciously aware of.
Okay, gotcha.
Other, I'm going to stop the recording now in case anybody wants to ask questions because we've covered everything. So let me do that.